In 3.14, Grinding Gear Games announced that they were nerfing Bladefall Blade Blast. Unfortunately, Bladefall Blade Blast did not get the message. So I decided to league start Archmage, Bladefall Blade Blast, Necromancer. It's been quite a journey. My league start has been extremely successful. This build, amazingly strong, and has cleared all content that I've thrown at it, including face-tanking Cirrus from the first time I did him. In fact, content-wise, the biggest challenge that I have found this league was getting the Trial Master to spawn, which took around 600 maps. But it finally happened, and he finally bit the dust shortly thereafter. The build is super tanky, it bosses well, it clears maps to the point where you can walk from a normal tier 16 into a 60% Delirious or even 100% Delirious and barely notice the difficulty jump. And if you like turning on RF, you can turn on RF. As it turns out, the rumors of the demise of Blade Blast were greatly exaggerated. So now, let's take a look at some of the specifics of a build, get into the mechanics that make it work, and talk in detail about why it's such a great league starter. So I present to you the Archmage, Trinity, Bladefall Blade Blast Necromancer. No, that is not just me adding random words that sound somewhat similar. That is an actual build. I played it, and I'm going to tell you how. But before I get into the details, I want to add a few very important disclaimers, starting with number 1, prices shift over time. Even by making this video, I may have an effect on the prices of items. So things that were expensive for me at League Start might be cheap for you. Things that were cheap when I made this video might be expensive because I made this video. Prices are all subject to change at any given time. And number 2, guides are guidelines. You do not have to have every single exact item that I have in this build. If you just don't consume corpses, you're going to wonder why your mana recovery feels so sluggish. If you just don't have block or just don't use an offering skill, then you're going to wonder why you feel so much squishier than my character. Pay close attention to the mechanics that are included in the build and the reason behind the mechanics being included. The reason behind it is far more important than the actual item, because if you understand the reason, then you can use different alternatives. If you don't understand the reason, don't take it out of a build, because you're probably going to have a bad time. And speaking of mechanics and the reasons we include them, let's start with why are we a Necromancer, and why Essence Glutton is the most important ascendancy node that you should be taking. And so why Necromancer as opposed to something like Raider? Well, Raider was certainly hyped up a lot at the beginning of a league, but the mana recovery for Raider is non-existent as a baseline. You need to get gear such as Cloak of Defiance, or such as a mana recovery amulet, before you're actually able to recover mana. You can do it, but Necromancer offers the same level of defenses as Raider, while solving your mana recovery easily. It should also be noted that the life you gain on block from Mistress' Sacrifice and Bone Offering is an amazing defensive layer that Raider simply doesn't have access to. So if you're looking for really top-end min-max, I'd probably honestly go Scion, and use some sort of dodge hybrid build. But if I'm league starting, Necromancer is by far the way to go, because Essence Glutton neatly solves mana recovery. How does Essence Glutton do this? It does this by recovering mana every time you consume a corpse. You can consume a corpse at a very basic level by doing something like Arcanus Brand, Desecrate, Offering, or Arcanus Brand, Desecrate, Volatile Dead. This will give you a very simple way to consume corpses. However, I much prefer using a combo consisting of the Corpsewalker boots, which will generate corpses as I walk around passively, and then the Kitava's Teaching Small Cluster Jewel. Early in the league, this cost me about 40 chaos, and as of the time of making this video, it's about 1 to 1.2 exalts. You can use Arcanus Brand, but it's much smoother to just use the Kitava's Teachings, and you get an additional 5% of life and mana recovered every second if you do, which is a great way to add to your recovery. Now, if you want to be careless while mapping and state in almost everything, you can also take Curse Concoction. The point above Curse Concoction causes you to recover 2% of mana on kill when you kill a cursed enemy. This is very similar to the effect of Mind Drinker, but it's far more point efficient and doesn't use up an anointment. From there, the Necromancer Ascendancy does a ton to scale the build's defenses. Damage in Path of Exile is already quite easy to scale, and movement speed and damage don't matter if you're constantly dead. So Necromancer scales your defenses, both by adding block via Bone Offering, the mana recovery via Essence Glutton, chilling enemies which makes it harder for them to hit you, and finally, causing them to deal 10% reduced damage on Plaguebringer. This will give you the best League Star experience, and as someone who's played a lot of different Bladefall Blade Blast builds, this is certainly the one where I've had to pay the least attention to scaling my defenses via gear. It just kind of passively happened, and it felt amazing. Now that we've fixed all of the mana recovery, what about life recovery? Life recovery is mainly built around Agnostic. Agnostic is a core part of life recovery for most mind over matter builds. The idea here is you have a massive amount of mana recovery, so you turn that mana recovery directly into life recovery by sacrificing 20% of mana a second to recover that much life. This is where the Raider really struggles in early gear. The Raider cannot maintain Agnostic, which makes you far, far squishier and often reliant on a life flask or on kill effects to get that life back. Necromancer doesn't really care. You can just use Agnostic from pretty much normal lab when you pick up Essence Glutton, and you'll be good to go. Your mana will drain a little bit, but it won't be too detrimental to the functioning of your build. This means damage over time effects are very unlikely to kill you, and unless 2 or 3 hits happen in extremely quick succession, you'll be able to mostly ignore their damage. And even if they do happen in extremely quick succession, they need to get through your other layers of defense, such as block. So what if you wanted to min-max a little bit more? If you wanted to min-max a little bit more, you could use a trigger weapon like mine. I made this by using the Ashling level 4 in Research to double veil my item. But you could very easily buy a weapon like this with good prefixes, and do prefixes cannot be changed, and use a Veiled Chaos until you're able to get a trigger socketed spells when you use a skill with a 4-second cooldown. I then put Desecrate, Spell Cascade, Link Together, and Bone Offering in the weapon. Every 4 seconds, I will generate 10 corpses. I will eat 6 of them immediately with a Bone Offering, and then I will eat the additional 4 over the next 4 seconds with Disciple of Kitava. That does mean I lose the 50 flat mana regen from Essence Glutton, but if I'm at the point of min-maxing this, I should have enough mana recovery from other means that I don't especially need it. And while mapping, especially in ultimatums, there's going to be plenty of corpses around to fuel it. It's really only a single target concern, where I shouldn't be taking all that much damage, and I shouldn't need all that extra mana recovery anyway. One thing that's slightly unfortunate about Blade Blast is, especially for the Archmage version, it kind of lacks good support gems. There aren't that many supports that scale your damage too well. You can use something like Awaken Increased Area of Effect, and it's pretty good, but it didn't really feel min-maxed to me. It felt like an easy way out. So I decided to use Trinity support. Now, speaking of easy ways out, with Trinity support, I could have simply said, oh, I'm just going to give up a ring slot and use Call of a Brotherhood. And if you want easy Trinity scaling, that is your best option. It'll be way easier to get roughly half of your damage to be cold and roughly half of your damage to be lightning if you simply use Call of a Brotherhood. But that requires giving up a ring slot. Giving up a ring slot sounds like quitter talk to me. So I decided to do full-on self-made hard mode. If you are not comfortable following these instructions, and if you are not comfortable gauging your character's damage, do not attempt to add Trinity to your build. You will probably fail. This is very optional, it's very finicky, and overall, I don't advise it for most people. So please proceed with caution. That said, if you do want to, here's the steps that I followed to add Trinity to my version of a build. The main problem I was trying to fix was the fact that Arcane Cloak adds a massive amount of additional lightning damage, which isn't converted by anything on the supported links of Bladefall Blade Blast itself, because there's no lightning to cold support. Again, yes, you can use Call of a Brotherhood, but if you don't want to do that, you have to do some manual balancing. Arcane Cloak will be up for about 70% of the time. This means you want to balance for when it is up, rather for when it isn't up. If you want a really quick example of Trinity in action, you'll see at the far left, there's that little symbol with the 3 bars that fill up. If all 3 are full and the symbol is shiny in the middle, that means you've balanced it correctly. If they are not full, if one is lacking, that means you've done Trinity wrong and it's costing you all of your damage. For my exact links, I'm using Blade Blast, Trinity Support, Elemental Penetration, Anomalous Archmage, Awakened Elemental Focus, and Awakened Control Destruction. Now the first thing that I did is adding the Anomalous Archmage. Instead of Archmage giving lightning damage, my Archmage gives a mix of lightning and cold, and I'm biasing it towards cold as heavily as I can by using a 23% quality gem. At 20% quality, I found I was still doing way too much lightning damage, because Arcane Cloak adds such a massive amount of lightning damage to the skill. And with a high uptime, again, I need to balance for when Arcane Cloak was up, rather than when Arcane Cloak was down. The second thing I did was swapped out the Awakened Lightning Penetration gem I was using for the Elemental Penetration. Awakened Lightning, again, biases your damage towards the lightning end, and you just lose damage because half of your damage, which is cold, is not being affected by it. Third, on my large cluster, I'm using Scintillating Idea, Snowstorm, and a third notable, which in this case is Widespread Destruction. The third notable does not matter too much. what is very important is Scintillating Idea combined with Snowstorm. Scintillating Idea is just really good mana and really good damage. Snowstorm gives you 8% of lightning damage as extra cold, which for me was a factor that pushed me over that threshold from Trinity not working to Trinity working perfectly. Then finally, a little bit of a warning. Be careful of your exposure. If you're inflicting lightning exposure, or if you're inflicting cold exposure, this could mess up the balance of your damage and break your Trinity. For my specific gear, I found that I can safely use cold exposure, so I'm using Frostbomb. But the ideal would be to use an Archdemon Crown in place of Crown of the Inward Eye, and socketing damage gems in there, so that I'll be able to inflict both cold and lightning exposure simultaneously. This will get you the best damage for your buck, but it is quite expensive and one of those things that you do when you're really done min-maxing everything else with your build. If you follow all these steps and Trinity is still not working, be sure to play with the numbers. If you look at the left, you'll see that the top left bar is lightning damage. If this never fills up, this means you're always doing mostly lightning damage and you need more cold. The bottom middle bar is cold damage. If this is never filling up, you're doing too much cold and you need more lightning. You can adjust various aspects of the build, such as getting increased lightning damage, such as dropping Snowstorm, Exposure, Penetration, and various other things, until you have Trinity perfectly balanced. But again, for most people, I don't advise this, as it is a lot of work, and it's going to be very finicky, and you may very well have to address it every time you upgrade your gear, because something could break. But if you get everything right, it is a large chunk of damage. I believe for me, it's about 15% more damage than using any of the alternatives, which, given that this build does tens of millions of DPS, is very significant. Now, let's start talking about some of the defensive mechanics that you should be integrating, why they work, and how to get them. Given this build functionally has infinite mana, one of the biggest defensive layers that you can get is scaling the Mind Over Matter effect, because you can kind of think of Mind Over Matter as less damage taken, or damage not taken. To start with, Mind Over Matter is 30% by default. This means you basically have permanent Super Fortify. If you want to continue scaling it, there's several options to do so. You could use a Cloak of Defiance, which is an additional 10%, or you could use a rare chest with a Shaper mod, with 6 to 10% of damage is taken from mana before life. These are the options that I would say are your baseline for scaling Mind Over Matter effect. If you want to get into some more advanced stuff, you can use an elevated mod, like my current chest piece, and pair it with a damage is taken from mana before life Watcher's Eye. This will get you up to 55% of damage is taken from mana before life, which is an incredibly powerful defensive layer, and is one of the big reasons why this build is just so damn tanky, and why it can take so many hits without really seeming to care. If you want to scale this even further, mostly for offensive needs, you can also scale a bit of mana recovery. Now, mana recovery is great, even just as a baseline, but if you want to turn on RF, Agnostic does drain a pretty significant amount of mana, so to counteract that, I used increased mana recovery rate on my chest and my belt. This totaled up to 24% from the belt and an additional 14% from the chest, for 38% total. If I was doing this again, I'd probably go with Awakened Offering Effect, for 35% increased offering effect, giving me significantly more block, rather than the mana recovery rate on the chest. I've made a couple since, haven't been too lucky with hitting usable things, so for now, it's just the Mind Over Matter mana recovery rate chest. But regardless of what chest you use, I would very much advise the increased mana recovery rate on your belt. You can roll it with Lucent Fossils. I did just Lucent Pristine to try to get life and mana on it, that's why you have the mana regen, and eventually something pretty decent came up. The chest piece I crafted by buying or rolling the mana recovery rate, buying or rolling the Shaper mod, and then elevating it, and then using an Awakener's Orb to smash them together. Depending on exactly what you want to roll, there's slight tricks here and there, i.e. you could use Lucent Fossils to encourage mana recovery rate. The damages taken from mana before life is both life and mana tagged, so again, if you use Lucent Pristine, you're very, very likely to roll that. Offering effect is much harder, so unfortunately, you kind of just have to RNG or alt spam your way into that one, or maybe buy a pre-rolled chest. The next layer of defense, which is something that I only added when I started min-maxing the build, is chance to avoid elemental ailments. There's a lot of silent killers among ailments, from shock, scorched, to brittle, and sometimes even sapped, where your damage just goes down and you don't know why. Being completely immune to elemental ailments is great. I do this via 20% from Arcane Swiftness on the tree, 15% from my anointment, 30% from my chest piece, and 35% from boots. To open up my anointment for either more damage or additional layers of defense, I could instead go with an awakened 50% chance to avoid elemental ailments on my boots. Again, for crafting something like this, the method varies Personally, I just bought my boots. If I were to just craft the 50% avoid, I would roll the boots or purchase boots with 31 to 35% chance to avoid elemental ailments. The other mods I wanted, such as move speed, etc., or open prefixes, because I could use Veiled Chaos Orb or Ashling to fix prefixes later, and a second shaper mod in the suffixes. If I use the second shaper mod in the suffixes, I'll have a 50% chance to get what I want, and a 50% chance to get a base that I can probably sell to someone else, assuming the mod isn't something dead, like chance to avoid being stunned. Then the next defensive layer is the gloves, which are blind, faster casting gloves. There's two options here. You can either go blind, faster casting, which is done on a shaper base, or blind with more attack and cast speed, which is essence rolled and can be done on either a shaper or redeemer base. The main idea here is blind is a good defensive layer while mapping. It keeps enemies from being able to hit you easily with attacks because it gives them a flat 50% miss chance. This requires no investment into evasion, and so it's quite efficient. Faster casting is because Bladefall is a 0.7 cast speed, which makes it slow and clunky to use. Having faster casting in your links is going to feel great. If you want to know more about Bladefall and its mechanics and exactly what supports to use in Bladefall, I suggest looking at my Bladefall Blade Blast mechanics guide, which I will link in the description and you'll see in the card. There's several ways to roll these gloves. If you're using a shaper base and you want faster casting, you can do Reforged Caster from your harvest. You can also do something like Etheric Fossils or Shuddering Fossils to encourage caster and speed mods, or you can spam essences and Geffa Blind and have decent gloves. I very much advise having the faster casting or more cast speed as a priority. The blind is quite nice, but your build should be tanky enough without it that it's totally fine. You really want the faster casting or more attacking cast speed. Of those, I find the faster casting is a little bit easier to get and tends to be a little less expensive because you can just roll it with your harvests. Now I mentioned Arcane Cloak in passing. It is both a very powerful offensive buff as you gain damage based on the amount of mana spent, and also a very powerful defensive buff as it adds a shield for about 6,600. Because this is a Necromancer build, there's a very high uptime, especially with Unnatural Instinct. Be sure to link both Arcane Surge, so that you get the Arcane Surge buff, along with Second Wind, to your Arcane Cloak. This is to maximize the uptime, maximize the damage, and maximize the defense. Now, there's a few other items that I haven't really spoken about before now. That's because these aren't really core, integral, mechanical pieces of the build. They're either just nice items to have, or things that can really be any old rare. In the case of the helmet, it's quite nice to use Crown of the Inward Eye. Now, I mentioned earlier, something like an Archdemon Crown might be ideal. It would take quite a lot of resources to craft an Archdemon Crown that replaces Crown of the Inward Eye. So for most people, you can consider this a best in slot. I'm using a Blade Blast enchantment. The Blade Blast enchantment is very nice for additional area of effect. But if you can't find it, don't worry too much. Any old crown will be fine. For the amulet, I'm using that series foible for more or less the same reason. While you can use a Zopek amulet instead, it's far, far more expensive to craft that amulet, and that amulet's really not that much better. So I would just use the Atziri's foible and call it a day. For the anointment, I'm anointing Crystal Skin to be Elemental Ailment immune. If you are not using Crown of the Inward Eye, you'd want to anoint Crusader. And if you are already Elemental Ailment immune, and you have Crusader already via Crown of the Inward Eye, there's a few other options. That's really just a matter of putting your character into Path of Building and picking the highest DPS, or the most life, or the most mana, or whatever you want to go for at that point. Then I am using one Curse on Hit Ring for Elemental Weakness. If you're not using Trinity, it's probably better to use Conductivity, but if you're using Trinity, you want to be scaling the hit from both your cold and your lightning damage, so again, Elemental Weakness is the best option here. Then that leaves the last ring and the shield. For the shield, it's important to have chance to block spell damage. Life and mana are very good, and fill in with resists. Ideally, you might want something like Recover Life on Block to make yourself even tankier, but as you can see, I don't have it, and I'm not struggling with anything. So think of that as the thing that you do last, when you're really min-maxing to get the last little bits of power out of your character. My other ring is a Cerulean ring with life, mana, and resists. Again, the stats don't matter too much here. They're not too specific. It's more about having life and mana, and then filling in with whatever resists you happen to be lacking elsewhere, since there are more important things on other items. Keep in mind, I have Dex on my gloves. If you don't have Dex on your gloves, you will need it somewhere else, and a ring is a very good spot to get it. Now let's get into the skill tree quickly. Like with most skill trees in Path of Exile, it's about going to the nodes that you want or need, picking up things that are efficient along the way, and then filling out from there. So in this case, it's important to get Elemental Overload, Agnostic, and Mind Over Matter. Those are the things that you absolutely need. From there, you want as many mana nodes as possible, which is why we come over to Prodigal Perfection, Mystic Bulwark, Curse Concoction, Arcane Capacitor, and so on. Life nodes are of course still relevant to the build, which is why we go down to things like Devotion, over to Written in Blood, grab Purity of Flesh, and come through the Scion Life Wheel. Dynamo is a very powerful node, and should be included in pretty much every Mind Over Matter build because you recover 20% of mana over 1 second when you use a guard skill. And I like to come down all the way to Battle Rouse, since it gives damage taken recouped as mana, which is yet another recovery engine, and it's pretty efficient in terms of the amount of mana that you get for the point investment of 4 points. Now, I know you might have noticed that there's a lot of circles in the tree, starting with the Thread of Hope. It is a large thread. The main idea here is that these notables are all very efficient, but the pathing to them is not. For example, Sanctuary is a very good node, giving 4% chance to block attacks and spells. But is it still a good node if you have to path all the way to it? Well, no, it doesn't really seem worth 7 points. It's great for 1 though, and that's why you use Thread. Unnatural Instinct is also an incredibly efficient use of time. You can path over to it, grab life, mana, cast speed, area of effect, mana regen, damage. There's so many things here that are quite helpful. It's an expensive piece, you absolutely don't need it. If you don't take a Natural Instinct, but you do take that socket, be sure to path through the mana instead of a life regeneration. But if you can afford it, absolutely include it. Anatomical Knowledge is something that I'm using to more or less shore up my life. It's plus 30 max life, 8% increased Corrupted Blood cannot be inflicted on you. Without the Corrupted Blood, I wouldn't suggest using an Anatomical Knowledge here. I'd just go with a % life, % mana rare jewel, or something like that. But I ended up being able to get one with Corrupted Blood, so I'm using it, and it does help to shore up my life pretty decently. Then of course, in the Witch socket, Healthy Mind, this is a great placement for a Mind Over Matter build, as there's so many life nodes that you can transform into mana nodes, including the Heart and Soul cluster. Then going over to the Cluster Jewel, I've talked about it already a little bit, but again, Scintillating Idea, Snowstorm, and any third notable. Make sure to keep your Teachings of Kitava in there, and the other one is just a mana small cluster with Scintillating Idea. The Watcher's Eye, as I covered earlier, is damage taken from mana before life while affected by Clarity. You can instead do something like increased mana recovery rate. That's also pretty good and tends to be a bit cheaper. Then, once you've got the core of your tree down, make sure to round everything out with Arcane Guarding and Arcane Swiftness. These two will give a decent bump to your damage, a lot of extra block, and also a little bit of Elemental Ailment Avoidance, which is helpful when you're trying to cap. Similarly, Flasks are a good way to add a bit of offense or defense to your build. If you aren't Elemental Ailment Avoidance capped, be sure to use a Warding Flask, a Heat Flask, and I'd strongly advise a Grounding Flask as well. I always like to throw in a Quicksilver of Adrenaline to help move around. Defensively, I would take a Basalt and Quartz Flask for additional physical damage reduction and phasing. Offensively, something like a Sulfur Flask is quite nice. In terms of unique flasks, I'm currently using a Rumi's Concoction for block, which I'd use on both versions of a build. Taste of Hate, which is a nice anti-fizz defensive option and a little bit of damage. And Atziri's Promise, which is pure damage, doesn't really have any defensive benefits. Instead of a Taste of Hate, if you're able to balance your resists, I would instead suggest a Wise Oak, or you can go all in and use a Bottled Faith, but Bottled Faith adds about a 10x price tag and doesn't really add all that much over a Wise Oak. So that is a quick rundown on my gear, how I made a bunch of it, and what are the important underlying mechanics for this build. Again, please keep in mind Trinity is rather difficult to set up with the way I've done it, so you might want to pick an easier route or not use it at all, as the build will have plenty of damage even if you don't use Trinity. This build has been extremely tanky, this was a great league starter, and an excellent boss killer. Is the mapping outstanding? No, the mapping isn't outstanding. It could be improved by an explodey chest or an explodey weapon, but it's ultimately going to just be so-so. But that's not really the point of this build. The point of this build is to be a well-rounded character that can map well enough that it's not really a problem, while still being excellent at all other aspects of the game. If you want a single character to play all League and min-max, this is a great choice. I've min-maxed it quite a bit, and there's so much more I could do. I haven't even put influence mods on some of my items yet. It is extremely forgiving, it's easy to play, there's a lot of safety nets. If you do make a mistake, stand in the wrong spot, get hit by something, your Arcane Cloak can catch it, your Mind Over Matter can prevent you from being one-shot, your Flasks help with damage. So overall, I would say it's a fairly beginner-friendly build. I'm sure there's going to be comparisons made between this, Fire Conversion Bladefall Blade Blast, and Poison Bladefall Blade Blast, and ultimately, even as someone who's played all three, I struggle to pick a definitive winner. As a League starter, it's definitely either this or Poison. Both feel way easier to scale defensively than the Fire Conversion version. In terms of immediacy of damage, Fire Conversion is really satisfying and often a lot more direct than either this or the Poison version, as the top-end DPS can be a bit higher, but that comes at the cost of it being a little bit squishier, having half to a third of the EHP of the other two. Keep in mind that's still more than you need for every aspect of the game, including in hardcore, but it also means there's some things that you're going to get one-shot by if you stand in them by mistake, and you really shouldn't. This is actually, I'd say, the most forgiving of the three, so if you don't trust yourself, you feel like you're a bit of a potato, then I'd play this over the other two. Now my question to you is this: what is your favorite version of Bladefall Blade Blast, or have you never played Bladefall Blade Blast before? And if you are one of those few people who's lived under a rock and hasn't played the most OP skill in Path of Exile, I'm kidding, there's plenty of people who don't like the playstyle, and that's totally fine. Has this guide convinced you to try Bladefall Blade Blast? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And special thanks to all of my channel members who help support me so that I can continue to make videos just like this one. Your support really means a lot, and without it, I probably wouldn't be able to make videos of this regularly. If you want to help support the channel, click the membership button or the link down in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful and want to ask me a question in a more interactive setting, I stream at least once a week here on YouTube, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have relating to this video or any of my other videos. Thank you again, and I hope to see you on stream sometime. Have a great day.